Hello, lovelies. You're listening to episode 48 of the Broken Enchantments podcast, written and read by Elizabeth Wheatley. That's me. I hope you enjoy this week's episode. Be sure to check out my Patreon for next week's episode, now available. You can check out the links below. Happy listening. The air was still laced with the chill of night when Janir swung onto the sorrel that had been given her. Apparently, Cammy wasn't fit for the long journey. The group of more than 200 Argetallams and as many horses stomped and snorted about the large courtyard near the stables. Cerilius sat atop his steed with a straight back and an even straighter face. Canicade and Amilla were already aboard their impatient mounts nearby. Janir patted the neck of her mare, Triss. Triss snorted and chomped at the bit, dropping her head and trying to yank the reins out of Janir's hands. Every Argetallam was wearing a heavy cloak that would shield them from the sun during the day and the cold at night. Before long, they would be in the mountains, and then they would be making use of the furs in their packs. She caught a brief glimpse of Lucan instructing his own personal guards as they fell into formation around him. He gave no indication he knew she was there, and they had not spoken since he'd saved her life. Still, she was glad to see her father had kept his promise. That was the one silver lining in this whole endeavor. Janir had to make an almost constant effort to push aside thoughts of the inevitable bloodshed to come. Janir flinched, sensing the chalice before it came into view. It was red hot, burning. The power inside held the kind of light that belonged to volcanoes and wildfires. Light that consumed and devoured. 2 servants, flanked by honor guards, came from the palace, carrying a chest about the size of a large melon. The servants bore it carefully, and the Argetallams overseeing the parcel observed them with hawk eyes. The chest was secured on a litter between 2 mules. Once it was safe, the honor guards surrounded it from all sides. Cerilius, Canicade, and Amilla steered their horses around to flank the litter, and Janir took their cue, though her horse didn't obey her half as willingly as the others did. Janir's mare pawed at the ground, impatiently, scraping against the paving of the courtyard. Janir kicked the animal's sides to make it stop. The Lord Argetallam emerged in full battle wear with a dozen guards and attendants into the courtyard. Janir spotted Canistrith and Drusilla, but didn't recognize any others of his retinue. All eyes turned to her father.
Brothers and sisters, children of the Carcatan, many of you remember that nearly 2 decades ago, we thought the fertile lands of Brevia were lost to us.
There were a few murmurs of acknowledgement from the hundreds of Argetallams in the courtyard.
But now, in time for the new generation, fate has brought to us a weapon that will allow our allies to crush the Brevians beneath the heel of conquest.
His voice grew louder with each word. Several people shouted in approval. Janir knotted the reins in her hands, steadying her mare's withers. The Lord Argetallam's voice began to grow gradually louder.
Today is the day we set in motion a force that shall lead the path to victory soaked in the blood of our enemies.
Blood and death. Cheers rose from the Argetallam crowd, growing louder all the time.
We go now to conquer a land which shall forevermore be under the dominion of Argetallam lords, Argetallam princes, where our children and our children's children shall prosper, where the rule of the invulnerables shall be built upon the crushed bodies of our foes.
More cheers rose from the Argetallams. And what about the Brevians' children? They would live as slaves. Janir's stomach lurched. She felt queasy. The Lord Argetallam's voice rose like the thundering of a storm, and he shouted,
All hail Argetallam!
The Argetallams in the courtyard echoed his words and let out a battle cry that made Janir clamp her hands over her ears. Even Cerilius joined in cheering. The horses stirred with agitation, a few even feigned to rear at the clamor.
"To Brevia!" the Lord Argetallum cried.
"To Brevia!" echoed the Argetallams. With that, the Lord Argetallum swung aboard the back of his coal-black steed and led the way from the courtyard. The Argetallams fell into a column behind their leader. Cerilius's mount was aligned beside Janir's as they marched through the streets of Adasha, flanking the chest. Canicade and Amilla guided their mounts to walk on either side of Janir's horse along the cobbled road. From the top levels of houses, people leaned out to cheer them on, calling out blessings and hopes of success in spite of the indecent hour. The procession made their way to the city gates and were greeted with the same fanfare. They filed out, and as soon as they were completely clear of the streets, the command was given, and the entire company spurred their horses into a brisk trot. Wrapping her cloak tighter around her shoulders, Janir held her hands out to the fire, trying to soak in as much heat as she could. Amilla, Cerilius, and Canicade all did much the same thing. The small Argetallam army was making their way through the cold, barren foothills of the mountains toward Valmakan, having left the official borders of the Staspin Waste the day before.
"We're not even there yet, and we're already freezing to death," Cerilius muttered. "We've all been to Brevia in winter before," countered Canicade. "We've all lived to tell the tale."
"With all our digits," added Amilla, "though not all of us escaped unscarred."
Cerilius rolled his eyes. "How witty."
Amilla let off a chirp of laughter. She glanced to Canicade, but he just shrugged. Apparently, it was some private joke. Around them, the 200 Argetallams had set up camp. The wooden casket containing the chalice was guarded at all times. Janir had been told to avoid speaking with other people and stay close to Cerilius, Canicade, and Amilla. Even if she hadn't been told to, she still would have stayed near them. There was an uncomfortable sense of displacement near the other Argetallams. The great blue and white mountains soared away into the clouds to the north. Cerilius had estimated that they would reach Valmakan within 2 days. Their travel had been easy at first, but the further they had ventured from the comparative warmth of Adasha, the harsher the cold had become. Now they had to watch for patches of icy ground, and though there was still sand under their feet, it was coated in a thin layer of white. Whenever someone took a step, it exposed the sand and gave the ground nearby a dirty look. The scraggly, naked branches of the mesquite trees spread against the sky, the horses tied by the trunks. "So," Janir began, keeping her voice down so that no one outside of their circle would hear. "Where is Valmakan? Is it a Slavish base?" A sigh of irritation rose from Cerilius. "What? I never thought to ask. And I don't remember." She bit her lip. She couldn't help that so much was missing. Amilla, Canicade, and Cerilius glanced to one another expectantly. Cerilius was the first to answer.
"Valmakan is neither a base nor Slavish. It was a city-state in the Gideon Mountains, the largest inland center of commerce in the known world." Canicade nodded. "It was the only place on Earth where Argetallams, elves, Brevians, anyone from anywhere, could trade freely with anyone else."
"Was?" Janir adjusted her cloak, pulling it higher around her neck. "Something wiped out all the people about 100 years ago," Amilla explained. She wiggled her eyebrows and added in a dramatic tone, "Nobody knows what." "Very funny," Janir scoffed. "What happened?" She turned to Canicade and Cerilius. Canacade arched his eyebrows.
She's telling the truth.
A smug look came over his face at her befuddled expression.
Nobody's quite sure, though we think it must have been some sort of plague. A few Tathansian traders who had been there but a week before arrived at the city to find the gates deserted and bodies in the streets,
Cerilius explained.
They turned right around and never went back.
What? They just left?
If you were a Tathansian trader with 10 children, a wife, and aged parents to support, and you came upon a city obviously stricken with some great horror,
wouldn't you turn around and avoid the cursed place rather than risk spreading the disease to your family and or catching it yourself? Amilla made an offhanded gesture in the air. Janir shrugged. So, how long since the Slavish set up there?
About 6 months ago. The Brevians and Slavish alike have been avoiding it for obvious reasons. But the Sultan and his advisors saw that it would be a good place to camp their armies,
Canacade offered. He had a certain way of grinning and winking at the right points to make even something so mundane sound like a joke. Janir caught a flicker of motion and turned to see her father, ermine cloak about his shoulders, not a guard or attendant in sight, kneeling in the snow, addressing several bundled-up Argetallams around a nearby campfire. They spoke for some time. After a few moments, the Lord Argetallams rose to his feet. The Argetallams he had been speaking with moved to stand, but he bade them stay as they were. Her father stopped by several other campfires before he made his way to that of Canacade, Cerilius, Amilla, and Janir.
How fare the finest of my warriors?
The Lord Argetallams sank to the ground on one knee between Amilla and Canacade.
We've been better, my lord, responded Cerilius.
But also worse, added Amilla.
Indeed.
The Lord Argetallams came very close to laughing.
I confess, I prefer the beach myself. The weather will grow colder the further we venture into the mountains. But once we arrive in Valmakan, we should be housed in buildings.
Janir perked at that. Buildings? Real buildings with roofs, fireplaces, and solid walls?
Not that I can vouch for the quality of those buildings, the Lord Argetallams qualified.
To serve you doth suffice, my lord, Amilla interjected. Janir thought it would be a great pleasure to please her father, to see him beam at her with satisfaction. But then, it would also be a great pleasure to have a steaming bath at about that moment. She felt instantly ashamed of herself. But why had her father insisted on bringing them into Brevia when the snows still hadn't melted? Wouldn't they have to worry about avalanches soon?
Some may doubt my judgment, bringing us here at this time of year. I have my reasons.
The Lord Argetallams locked his eyes onto his daughter as he spoke those words. Janir wondered with a shiver of alarm if he had somehow heard her thoughts, even though logic told her it was impossible. I trust your judgment beyond my own, my lord, Janir responded, humbly inclining her head. And she meant it.
Keep warm, all of you.
With that, the Lord Argetallams rose to depart. Canacade good-naturedly replied with a smile.
A hard task, my lord, but we shall try our best.
You have been listening to Broken Enchantments, written and read by Elizabeth Wheatley. Don't forget to check out my Patreon for early access to episodes, bonus content, and lots of patrons-only freebies. You can learn more at elizabethwheatley.com. And don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform or YouTube. I'll see you next time.